Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Bridenstine, and I am the Acting Country Public Affairs Officer for the United States Mission to Canada. It's a privilege to be here with you today and with our speakers, whose presence is made possible by the Department of State Arts Envoy Program. This program sends artists, musicians, and cultural experts from the United States to audiences across the globe, both in person when possible and virtually like we're seeing today. My time in Canada has afforded me the privilege of diving deeper into the shared Black history of our two countries, from the freedom seekers of the Underground Railroad to the first Black NHL player, Willie O'Ree. There are so many points of connection and so much to learn. But as we celebrate Black History Month, it is imperative that we celebrate the work of history, the labor that it takes to preserve our past and give voice to those long silenced stories. I'm pleased to introduce two cultural experts who have dedicated their lives to just that, Jobie Hill and Joe McGill Jr. Jobie and Joe work in the places and spaces where Black history lives. They bring a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I am as eager as all of you to begin the discussion. So I will hand over the mic to our moderator, Professor Charmaine Nelson. Professor Nelson is a professor of art history and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement at Nova Scotia College of Art and Design at the University of Halifax, where she is also the founding director of the first ever institute focused on the study of Canadian slavery. Professor Nelson has made a groundbreaking contribution to the field of visual culture of slavery, race and representation, and Black Canadian studies. Her impressive biography includes 7 published works, active engagement with lay audiences through media work, blogs for the Huffington Post Canada, and writing for the Walrus. Professor Nelson, it is a joy to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you for joining us. And I'm so happy to be here to be able to learn from my two esteemed colleagues, Jobie Hill and Joseph McGill Jr. So I'll just begin by introducing them. And please be aware that I'm only giving very partial information about their illustrious biographies. So you can follow up with them individually if you want to know more. And they're actually, after I speak, going to introduce themselves to all of us. And then we're going to go into a question period where I'm going to be asking them some questions and moderating some questions and discussion with them. And then we're going to open it up to the floor for a more vigorous Q&A. So I'll start by introducing Joseph McGill Jr. So Mr. Joseph McGill Jr. is the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project and a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. Since 2016, Mr. McGill expanded the Slave Dwelling Project to offer a program of living history called Inalienable Rights, Living History Through the Eyes of the Enslaved. The project has held an annual conference since 2013. McGill is also the founder of the company 54th Massachusetts Reenactment Regiment in Charleston, South Carolina. Prior to his current position, McGill was a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, working to revitalize the Sweet Auburn Commercial District in Atlanta, Georgia, and to develop a management plan for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. Jobie Hill, our second illustrious speaker, is a licensed preservation architect and slave house expert with over 17 years of a professional experience. She has degrees in historic preservation, art history, and anthropology, and is a leadership in energy and environmental design accredited professional. Since 2011, her research and professional work has focused exclusively on the architectures of slavery. She is engaged in interdisciplinary research examining slave houses, the influence these dwellings had on the lives of their inhabitants, and the preservation of the history of enslaved people. In 2012, she started an independent project titled Saving Slave Houses, with the primary goal to ensure that slave houses, irreplaceable pieces of history, are not lost forever. She also created the Slave House Database, a comprehensive national architectural and anthropological survey of slave houses. So please welcome Jobie Hill and Joseph McGill Jr. And I'll pass it off to.
My name is Jobie Hill. My personal mission is to advance an evidence-based understanding and acknowledgement of the institution of slavery in America. A cornerstone of this effort is the belief that the histories of many non-white Americans have been told to them and not by them. And to that end, I am dedicated to the interpretation and preservation of the living and working environments of enslaved people, integrated with their own oral histories and historical records related to the business of slavery. My professional work to date has been the documentation, preservation, and interpretation of slave houses. In 2012, I started an independent project titled Saving Slave Houses to ensure that slave houses were not lost forever, but also to change the way we think, research, document, interpret, preserve, restore, teach about, and learn from slave houses. One of the most important components of the Saving Slave House project is the Slave House Database. The Slave House Database is a comprehensive interdisciplinary national study of slave houses in the US. The database has two parts, documentation and interpretation. The documentation is a visual representation of the spaces, and the interpretations are descriptions of the spaces from the actual inhabitants who lived and worked there during slavery. Its inclusion of narratives from formerly enslaved people who lived in the houses gives a voice about the human condition with the physical structure. The database is designed to be a resource for researchers, descendants, museums, organizations, and the public to study and interpret the surviving evidence of slavery and to serve as a way to preserve and study the important but largely lost slave house. The Slave House Database also includes new current documentation for each of the slave houses. The documentation represents survey work that I have completed and will continue to do. To date, I've completed surveys of approximately 700 buildings at over 150 sites across 7 states and have driven over 9,000 miles. For myself, field work provides a perspective that can only be gained from personally interacting with and experiencing a space. There's no substitute for standing in a slave house and experiencing the overwhelming rush of emotions that comes with it. I was employed at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, as the preservation architect and Mulberry Road project manager during the Mountaintop Project. During this time, I did the research for, designed, and I am the architect of record for the recreated slave house known as the Hemmings Cabin. As part of my ongoing research into slave houses, I transcribe and analyze unpublished family plantation documents. There's a large number of available underutilized resources that could yield more accurate portrayals of the environment and circumstances of enslaved people. By studying these resources, researchers have the opportunity to discover critical information that has been marginalized. Lately, my efforts have been focused on working with descendants of enslaved communities. I believe they are the missing voices from contemporary interpretations at historic sites of slavery. Conducting interviews with descendants of enslaved communities will be a key component in understanding the cultural and survival strategies of these overlooked people. Having a physical space to experience and interact with is one of the best ways to help people grapple with some of the complexities and harsh conditions that slavery imposed. Unfortunately, many people won't have the opportunity to experience this in person. 66% of the sites I've surveyed are privately owned. 27% of the structures have been demolished, and another 5% have been abandoned. So soon they too will disappear from the landscape. But with the use of technology and continued determination, the story doesn't have to end here. Technology plays an important role in the work I do. I use it in my research to explore the intersections between the built environment, history, humanities, and community, to then create digital humanities projects. To learn more about my project or to contact me, please visit my website at savingslavehouses.org.
Thank you, Jobie. Now we're going to go back to you, Joe, and see if you're able to screen share with us.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, let's try this again. See if we can do this. I hope. Thank you, Jobie. That was beautiful. It's always great hanging out with you and sharing this stage. Ah, there we are. Beautiful. Yes, Joseph McGill. I'm the founder of the Slave Dwelling Project, and it's a very simple concept. we find slave dwellings wherever they are in these United States, and we ask the stewards of these places if we can spend the night in these spaces. And it's an attempt to bring attention to these spaces because for so long, these slave dwellings have been ignored. Although they were there all the time, they've been ignored. And because they exist, therein lie that opportunity to bring attention to them by just performing the simple act of just sleeping there. So for the last 11 years, we've gone to 25 states and the District of Columbia spending nights in slave dwellings. And that image that you see there, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, that's where I am right now. I work here on a daily basis, my 9 to 5, and it's in my spare time, the rest of my time, that I find time to go around the nation, find these slave dwellings and spend nights in them. You see the group there that's in that image because I want to emphasize the fact that it's more than just sleeping in these spaces now. It's having conversations about slavery and the legacy that is left in this nation. Sleeping is very easy. Anybody can do that. But before we go to sleep in these places, we sit around a campfire. We talk about matters that deal with slavery and the legacy that's left on this nation. Prior to COVID, the conversation would include Confederate monuments, white supremacy, weddings on plantation, historical trauma. We would talk about all those things. And now, because we have to make adjustments, we go to these places, but the audiences are limited now. We still interact with people through the means that we're interacting right now and socially, through social media and the means there. The conversations are still the same when we broadcast on Zoom or Facebook Live. We still talk about those things, but another added element now is of course, the death of George Floyd, the fact that a lot of names are being changed right now, a lot of monuments are coming down, Confederate monuments are coming down. So we include that all in the conversations right now. The image that you see there is Mount Vernon, the home of one of our presidents. 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, which is not common knowledge. We teach a history that portrays these men as beyond human or almost godlike, and to add this element of the story, we get pushback. So I've stayed at 5 presidential sites so far, and we've got categories of places that we stay along with presidential sites. Another category is institutions of higher learning. A lot of institutions of higher learning owe their existence to that institution of slavery. So we also go to places such as at the University of Virginia. We've spent the night there. In other such sites, we've spent nights. There are compelling ways to tell the stories of the enslaved. It is a challenge because, of course, during that period in our history, it was illegal for enslaved people to be educated. So therefore, the documentation is not there. One would have to research to find more to help tell that story. But there are other ways that we tell that story, through the archaeology that we do, through the genealogy that's done. The archivists are real busy finding those primary sources to help us tell those stories. Well, one thing that I look for when I come to these sites are fingerprints in the bricks, those bricks that were made by enslaved people. Sometimes, if we look hard enough, we can find those places, those telltale signs of the existence of enslaved people, and that's one way of doing it. Of course, our future, I don't think that's showing up very well there on the screen, but what's that indicates there is that our conference this year will be September 30th through October 2nd. We will be coordinating this time with Clemson University, bring our conference to the public. It's going to be digital also. It's titled Changing Narratives in Changing Times. So, at some point I can give you more information, maybe in the question and answer period, more details on how you can get involved in submitting a proposal to be a presenter at our conference. So that's in a nutshell, the Slave Dwelling Project.
Thank you very much to both of you. So As you can imagine, I was so excited to be able to be with you here today, and I have a lot of questions, but we boiled them down to a few because it's very important that we hear from the wonderful audience as well. I think a lot of people who know a little bit about slavery understand that it entailed corporal punishment, and they probably often, people get their images and their understandings from slavery from popular culture, things like film. But I think what people don't understand more broadly is that slavery also entailed a strategic material and social deprivation that was imposed upon the enslaved by the slave-owning classes. And so the enslaved were deliberately restricted in what and how they were able to produce material culture. So in the Canadian context, we're dealing with a nation that has largely erased a 200-year history of slavery under two empires, the British and the French. And part of how that is enacted is through the fact that we had a temperate climate with a slave minority population, a population that ended up being smaller than the indigenous people and the white people in their communities. And because we weren't tropical or semi-tropical, we don't fit the typical understanding of slavery as plantation. So I'm wondering if you could both please speak about how you go about identifying and locating the sites that you work on, because I think your sites actually would be quite different from the sites in some cases that we'd be looking for in Canada. And are there certain private or governmental collaborators that aid you in these processes?
I'll kind of speak first, if that's okay. Yeah, so I think there's kind of a couple things to point out. First one, just when we talk about slavery, one thing I think people don't understand, especially in America, is that slavery was everywhere. So when people think of slavery, in America, they think of the South, like you said, plantations. But slavery was actually everywhere. And on my map, I showed that I found a slave house in Oregon. That's very far away from, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. And there are slave houses also in the Northeast. So slavery happened everywhere in America, and it touched everywhere because, slave owners were allowed to go everywhere. So wherever a slave owner went, an enslaved person went with them. So slavery really was everywhere. And so that's kind of something to remember. So it wasn't just rural, it was urban also. So you find, enslaved buildings, artifacts, material culture also in urban settings too. So for me, identifying buildings is I do it in multiple ways. Archival research, going through the records, old maps. There have been in the United States, there have been architectural surveys that have been done. One actually was done by the government in the 1930s. The Work Progress Administration was a big government program that was to get people back to work after the Depression. So to get many people, like architects, writers, just any type of job. And one of them was architects. And with that, they did a national architectural survey of buildings. And it's the Historic American Buildings Survey. And during those surveys, they happen to capture slave houses. So that's a resource. But then there's also, private sites. On my website, I have a suggested site link that people can tell me about, if they have they think they have a building on their property or they know of a building. And anytime I do a presentation like this, I'll get an email afterwards from people saying, oh, if we can oversight or conferences. So, word of mouth is another way to identify structures. Joe?
Yes, yes, they certainly are everywhere. 11 years ago when I started this project, I was in a box. I had slavery and plantations in the South. And they certainly belong there because it did take a civil war in the 13th Amendment to end slavery in the South. But that's limiting yourself because as Jobie stated, this slavery existed everywhere. It had a very large footprint, and we got to take into account that prior to the revolution, any place there was a population, a high population of people, chances are slavery existed in those spaces. And we got to look at this place as it existed as a frontier, the westward movement, and as it existed as a frontier. There was slavery going on also. Now, as far as the material culture is concerned, we were limited. We were limited in what we could accumulate, or what we could call our own, or what we could build for ourselves. That material culture that is out there is so rare, but it exists. Now, how do I find these places? Well, 11 years ago, it was me calling these sites, cooperating with the State Historic Preservation Office, in this case, South Carolina State Historic Preservation Office, acquiring a list from them. And, after telling them my intent and what I was looking for, acquiring that list and making phone calls and listening to that awkward pause on the other end when I asked these folks to come and spend the night in their slave dwellings. But, getting enough yeses from those folks to, start out on my venture. Well, now it's the opposite. It's those entities now calling me. Now, sometimes these are false positives, if you will. Some of these places are not antebellum, or did not exist as places where enslaved people were inhabited. Some of these places qualify as places where, once people became free, they started living in these places. In other words, the formerly enslaved are now living in some of these places. Freedman's Cottage is a good example of that. But I've also expanded the definition of what I'm looking for. 11 years ago, I was looking for an extant building, an authentic building, a place that was in its original spot, and is still there. Well, I had to relax that definition of what I was looking for, because if I had stuck to that definition, I would not still be at this thing 11 years later, and 25 states later, over 150 sites slept in. So it depends on how do you define dwellings.
Excellent. Thank you both. And maybe I'll just throw this question out to one of you, and then the third question out to the other person, if you will, so that we can get to a couple more insights from you, because you have so much to teach us. So one of the sites that is in most urgent need of intervention and preservation in Canada are slave cemeteries. And in practices of burial in Canada, in slavery, and for free Blacks and enslaved Blacks, were often segregated. So you'd have the Black cemetery, of course, and you'd have the white or other cemetery. So enslaved people, though, back to our discussion of material deprivation, of course, because they tend to be the most impoverished population in society, were very poor, of course, and would mark their graves often with wood as opposed to more durable material like metal or stone or other objects. So of course that led to a rapid deterioration. So I'm wondering if that's the case also that you're finding when you work on slave cemeteries in the USA, if you have, and have you also encountered situations where the desire to preserve has been impeded by private ownership? And if so, have you been able to partner with different levels of government to intervene so that you and other specialists can access the property? Because we've had issues with that in Canada with, there's one very famous enslaved or slave cemetery in Quebec near the border with Vermont. Everybody knows that it's a slave cemetery and is owned privately by a family that continues to farm the cemetery. So if one of you may want to speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah. I come in do in the manner that I operate in trying to make contact with as many sites as I possibly can. I come in contact with sites with various conditions of their cemeteries. Some of these places that I visit, they have no clue where the enslaved were buried on the site. For various reasons, they have no clue. One of those reasons is because of encroachment. The fact that the place is so landlocked by development, and that development sometime in the past has already built something over where those graves once were, probably were not even giving them the respect of moving them first. So there's that. But there are some places that I come in contact with, a lot of the presidential sites that have done the right thing by the cemeteries, and are continuing to do the right thing by these cemeteries. Right here where I'm sitting right now, Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. I just before I got on the phone with you, I gave a walking tour to a classroom, and it included going to the cemetery. Our neighbors to the right of where I'm sitting right now, Drayton Hall, they've done a good job with preserving the cemetery there. But there are a lot of places that I go to that they go the opposite direction. Not only have they not recognized the cemeteries, some of them don't want to, because a lot of times that involves communicating with the descendants of those who were enslaved on that property. And then there are those who just, some don't want to go there, some are not ready to go there. um, they're not as willing as others who are communicating with the descendants of enslaved people. Now, in the United States, it varies from state to state how well these graves are protected. Right here in South Carolina, a good example is a place like Hilton Head Island. Once upon a time, for those of you who are not familiar with Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, it's a tourist attraction. Beachfront properties, all that. But once upon a time, that place was not connected by a bridge. There was no air conditioning. There was none of that. That place was undesirable. Well, now that there's air conditioning and a bridge, well, it's now it's high value, property of high value. So a lot of people who once inhabited uh, those places, people who shared my DNA, are not there anymore. They're being gentrified. They're being purged. Um, and with that, access to these burial sites are sometimes denied, or you have to seek permission just to go to where those graves are, if those graves still exist and have not been moved or built upon. So, um, in that long explanation, I said that all that to say I've come across these burial sites in various conditions.
Thank you so much for that, Joe. To Jobie now. I recently, Jobie, to your point about finding, and for those of us who study slavery too, finding a slave quarters in Oregon is outside of the norm of what any of us would expect. So thank you for pointing that out. And to your point, Jobie, when I was a visiting professor at Harvard in 2017, I was really fortunate to visit the Royal House and slave quarters in Medford, Massachusetts. And again, who would expect that there'd be slave quarters in Medford, Massachusetts? But of course there are. And that was 2018, my visit. And I was fortunate to be given a tour by one of the caretakers of the property who informed me about an archaeological dig that had happened, I think, early in the 21st century. And she said that some of the interesting materials that were uncovered were things like games and toys that were discovered near and around the slave quarters. But interestingly, on the side of the slave quarters that faced away from the house where the slave owners lived. So I thought that was really instructive too. And of course, they recognize that too in terms of what types of activities, material culture were the enslaved able to participate in clandestine ways. So I'm wondering, Jobie, if you could talk to us about interesting or out of the box kind of finds that you've come across in your experiences working on these slave houses, and also if there's been intriguing things in terms of the spatial organization of the plantation or the quarters that stand out as outside of the norm then, if you will.
Yeah, so I actually have found some interesting things during my surveys, and kind of what you're talking about for kind of material culture of the enslaved people. One thing we have to also kind of remember is that I think there's more material culture out there that can be associated with enslaved people. It's just that it just hasn't yet been connected to them or associated with them. Because you have to remember that any kind of anything and everything is going to be credited to the slave owner. Any work that was done, anything that was produced or manufactured, anything, is going to be credited to the slave owners. Kind of like one of the things that I am always pointing out to people that seems kind of frivolous is that, so when we talk about buildings that were built during slavery, you know, they'll say the plantation owner built the main house, or they built this how they built buildings for their enslaved people, things like that. Well, that's not actually true. You know, the slave owner wasn't building slave houses for their enslaved people. The enslaved people were building their own houses, and the enslaved people were building the main houses, sometimes with white workmen, yes. But you know, that was the whole point of slavery, is that it was free labor. So you know, they were the ones doing the work. And so by saying that, you know, someone else did it, the reason, you know, why that is dangerous, and the consequence of that is, what it's doing is taking not only the credit away from the enslaved people, but it's also dehumanizing them yet again. Because by pointing out that they were the ones doing the work and doing it successfully, is to also point out that they were independent thinking, they were problem solvers, and they were creative human beings. So that's why it's important that you just make it very clear on who was doing what, even when it seems like not a big deal. It actually is, because we have to do everything we can in our power to make sure that we, give them back their humanities in many ways as we can. To your point about kind of finding interesting finds, so one site that I can actually show you, if you let me share my screen again real quick. So at one site that I was at, the property owners had saved items from enslaved women. And so the woman's name was Evelyn Webb, and she was an enslaved woman that lived at the site. And they had saved 2 coverlets or blankets that she had made, and also a chair that she had. And the chair had the initials of the children that she cared for. The slave owners, they kept these items from her and have been taking care of them. I mean, they know they're precious to them. And this enslaved woman was also important to them. So that's one thing I found. And I was very excited and grateful that they had a picture of this woman, because it's rare that you find photographs of them. And another items that I found is that the property owner at another site found bills of sale of different enslaved people and in the attic. And so as you can see here, they were in pretty kind of poor condition, and some were in better condition than the other. And I worked with paper conservators at Culinary Williamsburg Foundation to get them kind of cleaned up and pieced back together. And so one was for a Negro girl named Charlotte, and another for a girl named Nancy, and then one for a man. So, you know, it's kind of when you visit places, it's always important to, talk with the property owners to kind of learn what they know about the site, and to, see if they have any materials that they have kept from, slavery times that relate to the people that actually were enslaved there.
Thank you, Jobie. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to audience questions now, because the audience is really enthusiastic, thanking you both for your expertise and your contributions. And I want to make sure that you get to hear from them. So the first question is, have you worked with publishing companies or educational institutions, primarily with high schools, to incorporate the history that you're working on into existing curriculum?
Yeah. It can get tedious, because it is, sometimes it varies from state to state. The Slave Dwelling Project we have as a nonprofit organization, we've kicked that that idea around. And we had to pump the brakes. We had to slow down on that thought because of what I just stated. These curriculums, these guidelines vary from state to state. So what we're doing right now, Slave Dwelling Project, is we're proceeding on. In fact, we're going to have a program tomorrow right here at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, Living History program, where we're going to give folks the opportunity to access our living history, our blacksmith, our cook, our brickmaker. We're going to give them access to all these folks, and they could tune in. We're encouraging teachers to do that. We're encouraging, it's kind of come one, come all. We know that we're not going to conform to every curriculum that there is out there. But we do know that we're going to be offering these systems, these schools, these teachers, whoever wants to take part in what we're offering, the opportunity to experience these things through the eyes of enslaved people. In fact, our program is called Inalienable Rights, Living History Through the Eyes of the Enslaved. And we kind of say that we're kind of a colonial Williamsburg on wheels. In other words, we're not, we have not incorporated anybody's curriculum or anybody's guidelines into what we do, but we know that what we do is more than has been done in the past. You can go on to historical sites and you can see things being demonstrated, things that enslaved people would have been doing, and you will see these things being done, by white folks at some of these sites. So we rectify some of that by we're having the living historians who are well versed, well studied in these matters, and we offer this to our public.
And maybe I'll pose a second question to Jobie. Questions come in asking how many sites are open to the public in some form, and are there any sites to your knowledge in Southwestern United States?
Yes, so let's see. So from the sites I've been to, let's see, I said 66% of them are on private property. So what's that leave? 37 are, well, it's gonna be less than that actually. So yes, so few of them are on public property. And those are usually, historic house museum type places. And I have not found any in Southwestern United States yet. My goal is to find one in every state. So I do think that, and I think I will be able to do that at some point. It's going to take a lot of research, but I do think that there is some physical evidence of slavery in the built environment in every state.
Thank you for that. One audience member wants to know if they can access the slides from your presentations. So perhaps, do you want to direct that person back to your websites? Because I know, Jobie, you were sharing that you have a database that's online. Would they find some of those images online?
Some, but they can't copy them. They can email me.
Okay.
And ask me if they're looking for something specific.
Specific? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. I'll go back to one of my own questions again while I wait for some more audience questions. Once a site is identified, could you walk us through what your work looks like on the ground? Because for many of us, this is completely foreign work, right? So how much of your work is archival, let's say, in locating documents, maps, plans for a particular building or plantation of a site? And then how much is archaeological or anthropological or historical research done on the ground when you're actually physically present on the site? Can you talk to us about that, and also the type of teams that you work with? For instance, Jobie, you mentioned working with paper conservators once you've found the bill of sale. So what do your teams end up looking like? And I take it that might vary depending on what you're finding.
Yeah. So the work I do is very interdisciplinary, and that is very purposeful. So like, if I'll kind of give a site that's like has kind of a lot to offer. So like when I go to a site to document it, like I said, the kind of the person I do is first I have always contacted the property owner of the site first. I don't ever just kind of show up and say, oh, I'd like to do a survey of your site. So I always contact the property owner first. They know I'm coming and, or have said yes to that. But the first thing I do is visit with the property owner, and property owners vary. Sometimes they want to sit down and have a long conversation and share a lot with me. Other times they just, point me to where I want to go and say, when you're done, you can leave. So, the kind of the range of interest varies with every property owner. But so when I get to the site, the first thing I do is, walk the site after speaking with the property owner, walk the site and figure out what is there. Because there's always going to be, things there that I didn't know were there. But for my purposes, like I said, I'm there to do documentation of the site. So if I'm going to laser scan it, then I have to get that set up. And if I do that, then I have a team that's focusing only on doing the laser scanning. That's what they do. And I do photography. So, I take photographs of all the buildings, exterior and interior. So that's one thing that's done. Take notes about things, do sketches. So those are all, sometimes measured drawings. So those are all the different types of documentation that can happen at a site for me when I'm documenting it. And each of those are, can be separate teams and have specialized work that can be done. So photography, measured drawings, field sketches, and laser scanning. And sometimes I also, and things I'm working on including now are oral history from descendants. So that's another kind of piece of it that would happen on site. And then off site is archival research. And so there's kind of two different things I'm researching. It always comes back to the people that were enslaved there, but one research kind of avenue is the property itself. So, you're going to be looking at land deeds and trying to figure out the history of the site itself, who owned it over time and what buildings were there over time. And that, that will be found in the land deeds. There might be maps, there's going to be descriptions of the site and things like that. But then on the other end, you're researching who was actually at the site over time. So, both the slave owning family and the enslaved people. And there's many different, if you're lucky, there may be a lot of old family papers from the slave owning side. You can find, because like on plantations, that like their businesses, they will have business records. So, the plantation owner may have kept track of how he was working the enslaved community and how much work they did every day or every week, month, whatever. And so you can find out information about who was there and what they were doing when.
Thank you, Jobie. To Joe, I want to pose the next audience question. Is there a large-scale effort by museums or public trusts, nonprofits, et cetera, to purchase privately owned slave dwellings for preservation and posterity?
A lot of these places fall under various ownership if they still exist. Usually when people acquire a slave dwelling, it's by default. They're not buying this property specifically for that slave dwelling, or to preserve it for that matter. But you get those rare folks who they will acquire property like this, and from the word go, they want to preserve the slave dwelling as much as they want to preserve the other properties. I mean, the other buildings on that particular property. But normally that's not the case. There are a lot of private owners that I've come in contact with. We got to be sometimes a little delicate with them. We as preservationists sometimes push a little too hard. We had a case once where in Missouri, where we were advising this lady who had this property about what she should do. And we were talking about the Secretary of Interior standards, what she should not do to her property. Well, we pushed a little too hard on her because she, under the cover of darkness, she tore it down. So we gotta be mindful of that. I get a lot of calls from people who say that they know about these places, and if it's not moved, it's going to be torn down. So we get calls like that, and I try to get the right people involved to try to get these buildings saved. We as preservationists, we would prefer these buildings stay where they were originally built, but sometimes that's just not the case. And then there are the cases where some of these buildings, or some of these spaces are saved by default, meaning that in the northern states, a lot of the slavery was much more intimate in the sense that the enslaved people lived maybe in the attic or the basement. So in the attempt for these people or these property owners to save these nice, beautiful spaces, then they by default save the places where the enslaved also inhabited.
Thank you so much to both of you for your rich responses. So
Just to be clear,
Mhm.
just when Joe says the attic and the basement, he is talking about the main houses. Just so everybody's clear that it's the attic and the basements of the main houses that they were living.
For sure, and absolutely the same can be said. The research that we've done on Canadian slavery in the slave minority context, slavery was very urban in a place like Halifax or Montreal, Quebec City, for instance, Toronto. Enslaved people were commonly living in the homes with the slave owners. So we have to think too, as scholars and thinkers on this topic, about the hyper surveillance under which they lived. Right, living in the homes. There's one case too of an enslaved man being written up in the estate inventory as living in a cabin or barn on the property. So yes, things shifted in these temperate climates. Thank you for that. So I'll go to the last question. This is a really important one too. I think all of them have been great. Sorry, I can't get to all of them. But this question posed to all three of us is, what has been the emotional impact on us as the panelists, the people doing this work in undertaking this type of research? So Jobie and Joe, whoever would like to go first, and the three of us will respond here.
Well, I've been at this for 11 years. Right out of the blocks, I'd get some comments. One comment that I got very early on was, if I want to get in contact with my ancestors, why not I go visit the ape section at the zoo? So you get stuff like that. And recently I've been getting some pushback, but because I've been at this thing 11 years, I now expect some of the pushback that I get, some of the naysayers that I get, because they're inspiring. What that does is make me more aware that what I do is necessary. There certainly is an emotional toll. People ask me, well, don't you feel the presence of the ancestors? And I tell them, it might be happening around me, but I'm oblivious to it. I got my guard up, because that's a lot. That's a lot to deal with. There's a lot of historical trauma involved in interacting with these places. That's why for a lot of African Americans, visiting a plantation is not on their short list of things to do. And to immerse yourself in this project the way that I have, to be in seeking those type of interactions from the ancestors, I'm just not prepared for that. So it could be that I'm in denial that I continue to press on.
Thank you, Joe. Jobie?
Yeah. So I love what I do, and the thing about when I do this work, so I see slave houses differently than I think a lot of people, and definitely differently than how I've been taught to see them. So, we've been taught to see slave houses and enslaved people in the slave space, anything really that has to do with slavery, as in a cloud of shame. And it's something that we should be ashamed of and look down upon, because supposedly these weren't human beings. But that's not how I see it at all, because these enslaved people and their buildings, they were extremely strong people to be able to survive being oppressed. And in spite of that, they were also able to form strong family bonds and, create families, find happiness and joy in things in their lives, even though they were enslaved. And so, I see slave houses as symbols of strength, perseverance, and resistance. And that actually, when you know how to look at them the right way, then you can actually find physical manifestations in those buildings. And it's just hidden in the details. You just have to know where to look and how to look at it. So when you see the built environment in that way, it's not depressing work or sad work. It's actually exciting work, because every building I see is just one more example of how they survived and how they were actively resisting slavery. So yeah, so I mean, that's how I approach what I do, and I really enjoy what I'm doing.
Thank you to you both. And from my perspective, it's my 20th year as a professor now. I've been teaching a class called The Visual Culture of Slavery for about 15 of those years. And most of my students are usually about 80% Canadian. And I've had one student in those 15 years who came to my class understanding that slavery had happened in Canada. So we're up against a big, big deficit in this country. That student, by the way, had no content. The teacher had told them one line, slavery happened in Canada, and then proceeded to teach about a tropical southern plantation site of slavery. So that's just a bit of context. On a personal note, I am the daughter of 2 Jamaican immigrants, now Jamaican Canadian. And so I know without a doubt that in my family line, if I go back far enough, I encounter enslaved ancestors. But my perspective and orientation then is, although the research is very difficult because we're encountering continuously, as Joe and Jobie pointed out, histories of trauma, abuse, isolation, torture, strategically embedded corporal punishment, material deprivation, etc. The resilience and resistance of our enslaved ancestors is everywhere present also. So for me, I always think about too, the fact that if my enslaved ancestors who survived the Middle Passage, right, who were the ones who were actually on the slave ship, if they didn't survive that journey, I would not be here. So my approach is complete gratitude that I am alive, that I exist to be able to try to recuperate their stories. I live in a space of deep gratitude for that, and being able to practice as an art historian who looks at the visual culture of slavery, and being able to go forth and share this research, which is, I might point out too, it's not just a Black history. It's a white history. In nations like Jamaica too, it's an Asian history, because indentured servants from South Asia were brought into plantation regimes like Jamaica at the end of abolition in 1834 in the British Empire, because enslaved people did not want to work for the planters who had abused them for decades and centuries. So it's a multi-ethnic, multi-racial history. And of course, Black people are part of that, but we need to understand too the way that white people, Indigenous people, Asian people, et cetera, need to also own this history as a part of their ancestry as well. So I'd like to thank you all for attending. We are at 2 o'clock Atlantic Standard Time, and we're at 1 o'clock for most of you in Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for attending. Thank you to our illustrious panelists, Jobie Hill and Joseph McGill Jr. And I just want to remind you that this has been Preserving Black Heritage Sites. Our panel was convened by the Embassy of the United States in Ottawa, Canada, and this has been recorded. So please reach out to the organizers if you'd like to get a copy of the recording. Thank you for attending. And thank you again to Jobie and Joe and all the people behind the scenes who put this panel together. Very grateful to be here with you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.